Okay, I might kick it off. A few minutes past 3 o'clock, and if people keep drifting in, that's okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today to kick off the Semester 2 lineup of the Centre of Archaeological Research seminar series. Very excited to have this up and running again this semester. Given the current situation with lockdowns across many of the states, it's a good chance for us to get together, at least virtually, and share in some of the new archaeological research that's been happening around the world. And we're starting off today with Charles Radclyffe, who I'll introduce in just a minute. But first, I'd just like to acknowledge the Arnavon Island people, the traditional owners on whose unceded land we meet today virtually, and pay respect to elders past and present. This is, as I said, the first of several seminars this semester. Next week, we've got another one by Ray Tobler, and we'll introduce subsequent ones after that through the email list. If you do want to join the CAR email list, please email Matt McClurg or myself, and we can add you in. At this stage, all of them will be online, given the uncertainty around the situation, but later in the semester, we'll hope to host them as hybrid deliveries, both on campus at ANU and through Zoom. I've added as many as I can through to the panelist session. If we could just ask you to keep your audio off for the duration of the seminar, but at the end, it will allow us to ask questions in person as well, rather than through the Q&A panel. And without further ado, I'll just great pleasure to introduce Charles Radclyffe, who will be talking today about some of his work on the Solomon Islands. Charles recently finished his PhD at the University of Otago. Congratulations, Charles, where he is doing some groundbreaking and first-order archaeological research in the Manning Strait of the Solomon Islands. Continuing with his career, he aspires to build a career in anthropological and archaeological research throughout Oceania, with the key focus of improving cultural heritage management practices and protection and preservation of custom, knowledge and culture in the Solomon Islands, where Charles hails from, with general research interests including oceanic prehistory, inter-island interaction, seascapes, ceramic analysis, archaeometry, cultural heritage management, and of course, the Solomon Islands. So Charles, I'll pass it across to you.
All right, thanks very much, Ben. Yeah, thanks very much for this opportunity, and good full afternoon. So as Ben said, I'm from Solomon Islands, but to give more of a personal background to those who don't know me, so my mom's from Kiribati, and she was relocated from Kiribati to the Solomon Islands, so I have some family in Western Province, and I'll show a map showing where some of these islands are. And Dad's from England. So I grew up in Honiara. I'm currently in Brisbane, but I studied at the University of Otago between 2012 to 2020. Yeah, so the title of my talk today, Pottery Production and Exchange in the Last Millennium in the Western Solomon Islands, a ceramic sequence for Lauru, Choiseul. I'm excited to be able to give this talk. It's going to be based on a paper I published with and co-authored with some of my former supervisors, Glenn Sumhays and Richard Walter, as well as a colleague, Associate Professor James Scott, who's in Geology Department at the University of Otago. So this was one of the sort of outcomes of the PhD work. So it'll be sort of a culmination of findings from the field research, which I carried out in Manning Strait. So that's located just near Southeast Choiseul. So a combination of fieldwork findings and some of the pottery analysis. So before I continue, and I'll just quickly add to that graphic, there's a good friend of mine, Tili Graphics, and he did a great job. That was his first go illustrating pottery. I was really happy with how it turned out. And these are some examples of decorations and vessel shapes of pottery from Choiseul. And I'd like to give my acknowledgement of country. So I recognise the Australian National Uni and all of us present, wherever we may be, acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. So I recognise the Gambri and Ngunnawal in ANU campus area, as well as I'm in sort of northern Brisbane or Minjin, so I recognize the Yagara. And we pay our respects to the ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. So to give an outline of the talk, so I'll give a backdrop to Western Solomon Islands and show maps of the area where I did my field work and where some of the sites that I'll be talking about are located, as well as I'll give a background to the traditional pottery making in Solomon Islands, which has a very long tradition going back about 3,000 years. And I'll give a backdrop bit to sort of some of the sites associated with Lapita pottery, dating to around 3,000 years ago and a bit later, as well as within the last 1,000 years. But a general sort of premise of this paper and this talk is that a lot of our understanding about pottery making, it comes from late Lapita intertidal sites. So these date to between about 2,700 to 2,000 years ago. We have some knowledge about pottery that was being being transferred within the Western Solomons within the last 1,000 years. But through my field research and through the ceramic analysis, we now have a much greater understanding as to where some of the pottery was being made, specifically in Choiseul, as well as some of the transfer patterns. So following the backdrop, I'll give an outline of the research aims, as I was just talking about, and the approach. And the ceramic sites we'll be examining include, so there are 4 different islands. One is on Sikopo, which is located in the Arnavon Islands, and the other 3 are located in Choiseul. They include Laina Island, Wagina, and Nuutambu. So I'll examine these sites in more detail. And then sort of near the end of the talk, I'll give a ceramic sequence for Lauru. So show examples of the stylistic sort of findings from the ceramic analysis, what were some of the vessel shapes, types of decoration, as well as importantly, what were some of the differences we saw in the composition or the fabrics used to make the pottery. And I'll sort of discuss the emergence and decline of pottery making on Choiseul in the last 1,000 years, and building on from what I was just sharing before about production distribution patterns, what disrupted, what impacted the making of pottery in this part of Solomon Islands. And I'll just give a few concluding sort of key arguments. All right, just a general backdrop to Solomon Islands. All of us very aware where it's located. So just southeast of Papua New Guinea. Has a population of about 700,000 people spread across around 1,000 islands, but there are 9 major provinces. And very linguistically diverse, around 80 languages spoken. And earliest evidence of human settlement goes back about 30,000 years, so very deep history. Specifically the area I'll be looking at, there's no current archaeological evidence to suggest going back that far, but a sort of side pursuit of my PhD was to investigate pre-Lapita or sort of late Pleistocene sites. So still searching. But Solomon Islands, importantly, is in looking at Pacific archaeology as a whole, really pivotal geographic location. So it's located just between where that line indicates near Oceania, eastern edge of near Oceania, and then entering remote Oceania. So importantly, the difference between these areas, in near Oceania, a lot of the islands are intervisible, generally freer and easier of movement, whereas as you cross that border, imaginary border, islands become far more sequestered or isolated and require much long distance, greater distances of voyaging overseas. So Solomon Islands has been framed in other studies, as a sort of bridge or barrier to looking at migratory patterns and cultural development over long term and over large geographic areas. And this is a more detailed map of Solomon Islands. So it's been split up in this map in sort of major cultural geographic areas. Our focus will be on the Western Solomons. And there's Choiseul there. And I carried out a lot of my field research in the Manning Strait region. So that's located between Santa Isabel and Choiseul, just in that area there. So I want to highlight a few sort of handicrafts or traditional crafts that are probably more well known, at least in today's age, sort of well known in the Solomon Islands. So these include shell money, for example, made most famously in Malaita, as well as wooden carvings with shell inlays. In this particular example, Nuzu Nuzu originates from the New Georgia group. So I want to highlight these traditional handicrafts as I was saying, they're particularly well known for modern populations today. Whereas pottery, if you would ask someone from Choiseul, mostly Southeast Choiseul, or from anyone from Solomon Islands, usually they wouldn't know what pottery is, or that it was made and found or made in Solomon Islands not too long ago. So I'm currently a paper I'm writing is under review in the Journal of Pacific History, and that explores this a little bit more detail. So I focus mainly on historic evidence of pottery making in Siravanga, which is located in northwest Choiseul. So it interlinks partly, or links up partly with what we'll be looking at today, but we're going back a bit further in time, sort of 800 years ago or so, and reaching the historic period, and specifically looking at sort of Southeast Choiseul. All right, so pottery making in Solomon Islands introduced around 3,000 years ago, and there's an important difference between Lapita dentate stamp pottery, which is likely to date around 3,000 years ago in Buka, and then also finding it in the Reef Santa Cruz Islands. There's quite a large gap in the distribution of particularly dentate stamp pottery in the Western Solomons, and Central Solomons is predominantly aceramic, although there are sites with pottery there. So in the Western Solomons, where we'll place most of our attention on, so there's a tradition of more incised and applied relief pottery. So there's an example of some of the incised and fingernail impressed pottery from the area. So this period in time in the Western Solomons is characterized by communities being highly interactive and practicing long distance exchange and movements of pottery. So the tradition or handicraft of pottery making is widely practiced around this time, but it appears to enter decline from around 2,000 years ago. And that's been demonstrated particularly in the New Georgia group, as a lot of the pottery that were being found in intertidal coastal zones appear to disappear, or they disappear from around 2,000 years ago. And to give some insight into prehistoric pottery exchange patterns, so I was talking about those differences between the sites, and they're indicated there by the different symbols. So the green circles represent dentate stamped dominated sites, and the yellow stars indicate more of the incised and applied relief pottery found in the Western Solomons. So there's been numerous studies done on ceramics, particularly from the New Georgia group area, and these have demonstrated particularly that pottery was made locally, local beach sand, volcanic beach sands mainly used, and pottery was traded locally. There's also evidence, however, of very long distance exchange across the Solomon Sea. Specifically, some sherds have been sourced to Muyu Island, located in the Luciad archipelago. There's also some evidence of a few bits of pottery from New Georgia group being found on Bellona, on a site that dates to around 2,000 years ago. And then later in time, you're seeing the importation of pottery from Choiseul to New Georgia group and Santa Isabel. Our understanding of the movement of pottery from Choiseul is really limited to some of the research I've been doing in Southeast Choiseul, as well as some studying being done in Northwest Isabel, where there is evidence of pottery being imported, but a lot of the data is still yet to be published. And I will also highlight that there's been some sherds from Buka being found on Ongtong, Java. So I'm just showing examples of some of the very long distance movements of pottery that are particularly common from around 3,000 to 2,000 years ago. And then in the last millennium, it appears to become more regionalized. And I've also shown some exchange movements of pottery in Bougainville Strait. So this is particularly important to think about the last 1,000 years and movements of pottery in Choiseul. And interestingly, there's quite strong affinities, stylistic affinities between Shortland Islands pottery and Choiseul pottery, or specifically one of the sites. And I'll touch on that a bit later. So an aim of this study was to try to think about how does the pottery we're finding in the Manning Strait area link into these movements of pottery. All right, I'll just highlight a very important part in Western Solomon Islands prehistory, and that's the last 1,000 years. So as I mentioned, pottery appears to disappear or decline in the archaeological record in the New George group from around 2,000 years ago. And the archaeological record in that province only begins to become more visible in the last 800 years. And that's when we see a lot of shrines are found in the landscape. So that began around sort of 800 years ago. Very importantly also, as you see the emergence of headhunting, so around 500 years ago, and this intensified following the introduction of European goods in the mid to late 19th century AD. So part of this tradition, heads were seen as sources of mana and wealth, and particularly impacted areas where a lot of raiding happened was Northwest Isabel and parts of Southeast Choiseul. So Roviana, which is located in the George group, they were particularly dominant in headhunting raids. And here's an example, that photo in the top left. This is of a tomoko or war canoe about to head off for a raid. Exchange and production of shell valuables appear to really blossom and during this time period. And I'll touch on one of the sites where I found some of the pottery, but there's also a tradition of shell money being made there called kesa, and I'll talk a bit about that later. So a lot of our knowledge about this time period comes from archaeological, ethnographic, and historic research that's been done in the New George group. So another key aim was to think what can we learn from the archaeological record of the Manning Strait. So just give an outline of the research design of this paper, and sort of which overlaps with my PhD work. Was an important aim was to contribute to addressing our lack of understanding about the development of pottery production and exchange in the Western Solomon Islands in the last 1,000 years. So using mainly field research, as well as reviewing the previous literature, and then undertaking some comprehensive ceramic analysis. And then finally, just making interpretations and reevaluating, what is previous models that we put forward, how do our findings impact upon them, or what foundations is the research creating for further work to be done in this area. So the field research, I wish to highlight, it was certainly the funnest part of the PhD work, but it was certainly a collaborative effort. So I worked closely with the Solomon Islands National Museum, Santa Isabel Provincial Office, and the Nature Conservancy staff. So some of the rangers you can see in that photo in the top right. I also highlight one of the Solomon Islands National Museum staff. She's in the bottom left, Grinta Aleke Babama. She's, to my knowledge, the only female archaeologist from Solomon Islands. And it was a great pleasure working with her on our first field trip in 2016 in the Arnavon Islands. So overall, carried out 5 field seasons between those years and resulted in a recording of close to 40 sites. So I was very happy with sort of outcomes of the field work. And with my thesis, that's the title of my thesis there, which is available online just through the University of Otago, our archive website. But I'm happy to share anyone privately. All right, so the ceramic sites I'll be talking about. So I won't be able to talk about all of them in detail. I'll focus mainly on those 4 islands. So I'll be talking about Sikopo first, which is in the Arnavon Islands, followed by Wagina and Southeast Choiseul, and then Lauru Island, and then Nuutambu. Because the paper was quite detailed, there's quite a bit of detail looking at each of the sites and some of the movements of pottery, but I'll try to give a general gist of some of the, what are some of the major zones of pottery production, and what are some of the evidence of movements of pottery. So we'll begin firstly with Sikopo. So the Arnavon Islands, prior to work which was led mainly by one of my supervisors, Richard Walter, and he has an ongoing project there with the Nature Conservancy. Prior to this work, we didn't really know much about the archaeological record of the Arnavons. However, in ethnographic and historical literature, it was well recognized as being highly prized turtle hunting and fishing grounds. So ecologically, Arnavon Islands are very significant, as they're the largest rookery of hawksbill turtles in the South Pacific. So the red in the image there, the red star indicates the location of archaeological sites on Singapore. So we carried out the most comprehensive excavation as part of my field research. It was a 3 by 3 meter square. And I was very fortunate to be able to work with some of the rangers from the Arnavons. It was a big excavation, and it was certainly a learning experience. That was the first field excavation as part of the PhD, and involved work with Grinta, who you saw. So I'll give an outline of some of the key findings from the excavation. So the image you're seeing is a section, and it's showing some of the different layers and some of the key features that we identified. So I want to highlight some of these features because they were important in the dating and our understanding of sort of sequence of occupation of this part of the Arnavon Islands. So we carried out our 9 samples of mainly charcoal and shell were dated, and these indicated 2 phases of occupation to about 850 to 700 calBP and 625 to 500 calBP. And I've argued that these features, so we'll begin with the shell heap in layer 1B, is likely to be associated with that 625 to 500 calBP date. And these were very distinctive, basically just big heaps of trochus shell and giant clam shell that we were finding. As we were digging down, these appeared to disappear, I keep saying that, and reached a possible floor surface at about 60 centimeters. This was very compact and was overlaying what appeared to be natural coral below, so it's likely people were just sort of trampling, and it created a more compact surface. So we dated charcoal from some of these key features and be able to produce those sort of ranges in occupation. Yeah, I mentioned Grinta was involved, and she found the only piece of obsidian that was found throughout the course of my PhD work. And it was about the size of your fingernail, very small, but very fortunately, we were able to get a reliable reading from the obsidian, which was sourced to Kutabao in West New Britain, located over 900 kilometers away. So really interesting find. It was a great find, and we were a little bit surprised. We expected the obsidian to maybe be more likely from the Admiralties, so that was quite interesting that it came from Kutabao, although we argue, myself, Glenn, Richard, argue in our paper, it's likely to have just been passed down through down the line exchange. So Arnavon Islands, located southeast of Choiseul, but as you travel further northwest, there's networks of exchange that begin to have developed and intensified in the last 1,000 years in sort of East New Britain, and you reach Nissan, Bougainville, Buka. So we argue it's possible it's being passed down through those down the line exchange. I'll also mention, before moving on to Wagina, I'll mention there's another site we investigated, and it was a coral mound shrine, where we found some pottery which was a little bit distinctive to the pottery we're finding from this excavation. So it was a bit purplish and brown in color and quite robust and thick. So I'll talk a bit about geochemical analysis, the findings from that, which showed that some of that pottery found that coral mound shrine is likely to be imported from the New Georgia group, whereas a lot of the pottery from this in this excavation is likely to be made in Southeast Choiseul area. So the next slide, Wagina. I really enjoyed working on Wagina. So I mentioned my mom's from Kiribati. I've got family who live on the island. So a lot of the field work I carried out was with some of my cousins, some of the younger ones who are also very knowledgeable of a large number of headhunting burials that can be found around the island. And that's what really sort of came through in the archaeological work was that as showing a lot of evidence of headhunting in the area. So previous investigations by Daniel Miller, British archaeologist who was working in the Solomon Isl National Museum in the late 70s, he argued that found that it's most likely uninhabited throughout the period of recorded history. So there was oral histories of the area basically being abandoned, and this was at around the time, when headhunting raids were really intensifying. So the pottery sites that I was looking at were located mainly on ridge lines and hilltops. So one of the hilltops there is in the top right image. So a lot of the pottery from there I'll be talking about. And so we weren't able to carry out any excavations or radiocarbon dating of pottery scatters on Wagina. However, I'd argue that a lot of the pottery that you can find on that island is probably dated to no later than around 400 years ago. And so I've argued that based on radiocarbon dating of shrines, mainly in the New Georgia group, as well as partly from my work on another island. And so it probably dates to within the sort of historic period. And the third site, Lina Island. So here's an image of Lina Island. It's a photograph, and I'll be talking about two sites. So one in the northern end of the island called Apuseva, and one in the southern end, which both are shrine complexes. I was very fortunate to be able to carry out work on Lina Island. So how we came about doing work on the island was following our first field trip to the Arnavon Islands. One of the rangers who's based on the islands, he's a landowner and one of the chiefs from this island in Southeast Choiseul. And he was noticing, looking at some coral mound shrines on Sikopo, looking at pottery, and he was like, well, there's certainly coral mound shrines in my island. I think there'd be similar things you guys are finding. And he invited us to be able to go and do some, include Lina Island in the project. So I was more than happy to. And I was also delighted to learn that there was some custom stories that have been written about the island. So Choiseul's first native medical doctor, Guso Pico, wrote that Lina must be the original place of the people of the Avaso, or perhaps the Choiseul people in general. There's still some high stone walls standing there. So Guso Pico, very fortunately, he wrote in detail quite a bit about some of the practices of making a kesa, a distinctive type of cylindrical shell ring that was made in Choiseul. And from there, it seemed likely that we'll be finding sort of sites that may be similar to what we're finding on Sikopo. Although I was a bit skeptical because Daniel Miller, who I mentioned before, had visited the island, although he only just described seeing some grinding stones. So I wasn't sure if we were going to be finding pottery, but in the end, we were lucky to find some. So the first site is Apuseva. It's quite an important part of the island in oral stories. And when we were reaching this part of the island, other men were describing there's a particular cliff face that faces out into the ocean. And this is faces a coral road or coral reef that reaches up to Nuutambu, which is the next island I'll talk about. And it's quite interesting that this is still some of the remnants of sort of their cultural, sort of the sacredness around this part of the island. And I'd argue it is connected to some of the movements of people and pottery possibly going back a few centuries, but I'll get to that a bit later. So the site itself is a large coral wall and shrine complex, the largest on the island. And you can see the image there. So there's an outer wall facing the coast, reached about 1.5 meters high. So a really impressive site when you reach the area and once the vegetation had been cleared. And then an inner wall, and appears to be some sort of altar at the center of the structure. And the site contained a wide range of finds, mainly pottery, a lot of grindstones, interestingly quartz fragments. And the use of the quartz in this area, I think, appeared to be quite specialized. I didn't find many quartz artifacts throughout my fieldwork in the rest of the Manning Strait. And there are oral historical records. I mentioned native medical officer, Guso Pico. He described that some of the quartz would be ground up and then used as an abrasive. so in the powder, which was really specialized use of quartz, and that was quite interesting. And also ovenstone, 2 nut anvils, and some other shell rings. So we dug 2 test pits in the area in the inner stone wall, and we dated this to about 450 to 150 calBP. The second site is a coral slab structure, and it was part of a shrine complex with other structures, mounds, and another one similar to this. So this large structure consisted of about like a dozen erected coral slabs placed in a rectangular formation. And it was clear that a very organized communal effort would have been required in its construction. These were big slabs, some of them probably weighed over 200 kilos. And in the image you can see in the top right, so that's some of the men I was working with. The man in red, he's one of the chiefs from Rokoso village, which is located just opposite Laina. And Laina Island, I didn't mention this, but it's seasonally occupied. They basically leave it for copper production and they go fishing there, but no one really lives permanently on the island. It was abandoned in the 1970s and people moved to the mainland. So he's the man in red singlet, he's standing above where we dug one of the test pits. And you can see the image below shows the section, and I've put forward like a model outline of the original cut. And basically it was interesting, so we found some fresh coal dumped at the base of the slabs, most likely used in the construction. And we were very fortunate, got a rim sherd, part of pottery, which had some charcoal on its exterior surface, and we were able to date that, and it was included as one of those 3 radiocarbon dates. So these indicated this construction was, the structure was built around 650 to 500 calBP. And the site contained a similar range of finds as Apu Seva, the other one, the site I just mentioned before, but not as rich. And in terms of trying to understand what the shrine, what the structure may have been used for, so we dug a test pit also in the middle of the structure, and we were thinking possibly if it was used for human burials, but didn't come across any human bone. Although I mentioned there was a mound located just a few meters away from this structure, and we did find some human bone, specifically part of a tibia on the mound. So it's likely there may have been human burials associated with these, but simply we just need to do more, would need to do more field research to understand, have a better understanding. And the fourth site is Nuutambu, located a bit closer to central Choiseul. So in oral history in Nuutambu, it's one of the, in Choiseul, it's one of the most significant custom sites or traditional villages in this part of Choiseul, specifically because it's a birthplace of Kesa, which are cylindrical shell rings. And in some of their old histories, one of the water gods, Bangara Laina, is argued to have made Kesa on Nuutambu, but possibly collected tools from Laina Island, that previous island, before reaching there. So I'd argue it's probably linked with that, some of the oral histories, the remnants that they shared with me of that being a coral reef road. And I'll touch on a bit later how it appears that pottery made on Nuutambu is likely to have been exported or was reached and exchanged with people on Laina Island as well as Wagina. So the pottery on Nuutambu, very interestingly, has close stylistic similarities with pottery that's been documented in the Shortland Islands by Jeff Irwin as part of his master's in 1972. So they were able to produce one uncalibrated date from the work in the in the Shortland Islands, and that dates to around 1,000 years ago. So I've used that because I wasn't able to get any radiocarbon dates from our work on Nuutambu. I've used that as sort of like my anchor or platform foundation upon making interpretations and looking at the pottery. So you can see an example there of a large sherd, incised and impressed, we found on Nuutambu. And then, actually, I didn't find it. So that pottery and the pottery that I examined as part of my PhD was collected by Daniel Miller in the 1970s. I'll mention we did carry out fieldwork on Nutambu, myself and Solomon Islands National Museum representatives, but unfortunately we had issues with some of the local landowners and basically just internal disputes between some of the landowners there, which disrupted our fieldwork and we weren't able to continue. But yeah, you can see some close similarities between some of the decorations there. For the compositional analysis of the pottery, and I won't go into much detail because I won't go into as much detail as I do in the paper, my authors and I do in the paper. However, I'll just give an overview. So we analyzed 70 pottery samples and 3 sand samples. So these were sampled from those 4 sites then that I mentioned. Analyzed using a scanning electron microscope, EDS, and there was some petrographic analysis done. Basically just give some comparisons that were done by one of our co-authors, James Scott. And the petrographic analysis was simply just to help us in assisting in identifying some of the minerals that we were unsure of. And basically the process involved was producing a map scan, as you can see in the image there, and identifying some of the minerals by looking, using that machine in the photo in the bottom left there. So that's myself and Nick Hogg, PhD candidate at Otago, and pottery was sliced up and prepared into epoxy bricks, and then these were able to be examined under high magnification and using the SEM, as well as geochemical profiles where we'd be able to provide it of some of the minerals or sand that was used in the making of the pottery. And from there, each pottery sample was then compared, and the fabrics were compared to geological maps and previous ceramic studies that have been done in the Western Solomons. And that particular image of that map scan I've included there just shows examples of some of the minerals that we identified. Unfortunately, the D is missing. This goes ABC, but there's one of the minerals there we identified to be olivine. And yeah, really interestingly, that was the only sherd out of over 70 samples that contained olivine. And this particular bit of pottery was found on that shrine site I mentioned on Sikopo in the Arnavons, where it seemed quite distinctive from the rest of the pottery we're finding on that island. And we've argued in a paper that it's likely to have been imported from the New Georgia group. So the Coral Mound Shrine is a bit probably made within the last sort of 400 years. And so it's likely this bit of pottery reached the Sikopo, possibly with one of the Roviana headhunting parties visiting the area. But it was just an interesting sort of side note in the paper, and certainly something that'd be interesting to investigate in more detail. All right, now the ceramic sequence. So I'll begin firstly with the Nutambu ware, and I argue, or I date, the range date for this is between about 1,000 to 200 years ago. So this pottery is characterized by containing large masses of calcic amphiboles, hornblende, and plagioclase, which were identified in fabrics. And these were characteristic of the local geology. So it's a local Mount Matambe pyroclastic andesitic rock. Thinking about looking at some of the styles and the decorations. So the vessel shapes were dominated mainly by inward oriented spout-like mouths. So you can see some examples in the image illustration there, particularly you look in the top left. So they were quite narrowed and gently shouldered bodies. And the decoration we're identifying included lip notching, linear incision, single tool impression, and the brushing or wiping of the vessel exterior. So Nutambu had a wide range of types of decoration. And in terms of the date range, so I mentioned the Shortland Islands pottery had, Irwin was able to produce one radiocarbon date for that. So, but really I would need to carry out more fieldwork on Nutambu to be able to have a better understanding of this date range. And also there has been a possible late Lapita sherd found on this island, but currently we just need to carry out more excavations and radiocarbon dating to be able to determine if there's a late Lapita site there. So the next two styles will be Southeast Choiseul incised and impressed ware, and I argue dates to between 850 to 200 calBP, and the third is Northwest Choiseul plain ware. So I'll begin firstly with the Southeast Choiseul ware. So you can see the scale in that illustration on the right. So all the pottery above that scale is associated with the Southeast Choiseul ware, whereas those two vessels, I and J at the bottom of the illustration, they're examples of Northwest Choiseul plainware. So the Southeast Choiseul plainware, incised and impressed ware, differed to the New Tambu ware as it contained a high proportion of metamorphic clastic-rich stream sands, which are present in this part of Southeast Choiseul. And specifically, there's a geological formation called the Choiseul schist formation. And in terms of vessel shapes, they were dominated by outcurving pots with more noticeably flared rims and pronounced or sharply carinated vessels. With the Northwest Choiseul plainware, these are quite simplified and were made most likely in the historic potting center of Shirravanga. So in the paper, in the study, I wasn't able to actually analyze any of the bits of pottery that are likely to associate with this tradition. So it's definitely something I'd like to pursue further. But these types of pottery are quite well known. There's examples found in the museum, which made in Shirravanga. And a lot of they usually have very little decoration, mainly just lip notching. And there's examples of this pottery that have been found in the New Georgia group, which other archaeologists have argued, yeah, it's likely to date within this time frame, within the last sort of 200 years. In terms of how far back pottery making on Shirravanga goes, I'm not quite sure. It would require fieldwork in Northwest Choiseul, but unfortunately, I just haven't been able to expand my research out to that part of Choiseul just yet. All right, coming near the end of the talk, I'll share sort of discussion on emergence and decline of pottery making on Choiseul in the last 1,000 years. So prior to this study, as I mentioned at the start of the talk, was that we knew pottery was being transferred and made in Choiseul in the last 1,000 years and was reaching parts of New Georgia group, likely to be in Santa Isabel. However, we just didn't really have a high resolution understanding other than that. So this study was able to show there's likely to have been 3 zones of pottery production on Choiseul, one on New Tambu, one in the Kumboro region, which was near Lauru Island and is associated with that geological formation, that Choiseul schist formation I mentioned, and a third one in Shirravanga and Northwest Choiseul. So some of the ceramic sequence I put forward before shows some of the age range and how far back pottery making goes in some of these areas. Although I did mention Shirravanga, it may go back earlier in time. It's just a matter of carrying out more field work. So the pottery was used mainly as utilitarian exchange items, but also served ceremonial purposes as urns and offerings placed on coral mount shrines. There's a paper published in 2019 by the late Anna Craven. She was a British archaeologist, and just sadly passed away not too long ago, who was very helpful throughout the course of my PhD. So she's put a great paper in 2019 looking at dolo, which are these stone structures in Choiseul, and there's pottery normally found alongside these dolo and shrine sites where human bones were placed inside the pottery, so essentially used as urns. I didn't come across any in Southeast Choiseul, so that was interesting finding, and it would be. I'm definitely interested in trying to investigate that further. Why there was such a clear difference between the use of pottery in Northwest Choiseul, and just the other end of the island appears to be quite different. I touch on that a bit in my thesis, but I'm interested in investigating it further. And some important disruptions and what may have brought about the gradual decline in pottery making. So as I mentioned, from around 500 years ago, you see an escalation in warfare and headhunting raids. And Roviana in the New Georgia group, they dominated this. So we see the arrival of European intensification in circulation of European goods, particularly iron tomahawks, guns, and Roviana dominated that. They were able to take greater control of that and use it to their advantage. And I've argued in Manning Strait it becomes quite a sort of contested seascape. So I haven't really touched on it in this talk, but earlier in time, the late Lapita period, Manning Strait appears to have facilitated a lot of movement of pottery and chert artifacts, and it was quite sort of like an ocean highway, whereas in the last 1,000 years, this changes drastically. So it's likely to become more of a contested seascape, and Manning Strait was probably a barrier to the movement of some communities, for example, in Northwest Isabel and Southeast Choiseul, as they were probably, in great fear of being raided. You also see diminishing of the socioeconomic value placed on pottery. And in the mid-20th century, although I'm trying to pinpoint when it's expected more iron pots should be entering this part of the Solomons, but it's probably from around late 19th century, and then certainly from World War II, I can imagine it's becoming more common. So yeah, with the diminishing of the socio-economic value placed on pottery, it's quite interesting in that I mentioned those differences in, pottery being used as urns in Northwest Choiseul, as well as cremation being practiced there. Whereas in Southeast Choiseul, there's still quite a bit of decoration on the pottery, but yeah, it appears that those few major zones of pottery production, as you can see there in Kumboro region, I'm trying to still pinpoint when pottery making definitely was no longer practiced in the area, but it's probably occurring around the time where villages are being raided and people are being displaced. And the image I've included on the right there is from a recent visit I made to Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art. So they've have a small collection of some pots that have been made in Sirovanga, and they were made just within the last 10 years by a lady from Sirovanga. The group, they held a workshop in Bougainville that brought together a whole bunch of women from different crafts, and yeah, so she made some examples of pottery from Sirovanga, and you can see in the top left that pot was the sort of classic shape of pottery from this village. But she made some different types of vessels, a modern shaped one, sort of like a cup or saucer, as well as like a canoe shaped vessel. And yeah, it was great to be able to visit the collection. And it's certainly becoming rare because, as I mentioned at the start, the tradition is dying out. But I think it's possible that of ways of trying to revive it and just keep it going through cultural festivals. And I'm happy to even take any questions or just discuss this further. But it's certainly an initiative and something I'd look to push forward in the rest of my career. And just to conclude, so importantly, the research has provided a foundation upon which our understanding of the entire ceramic record of the Western Solomons can continue to be refined. So my research in the Southeast Choiseul is certainly, provides an important temporal spatial foundation. Certainly, I think there's room for more improvement in our understanding of the archaeological record there, as well as I'm very eager to be able to try do some work in Northwest Choiseul, because Choiseul in the Western Solomons is very understudied. A lot of the work, there's only been basically a handful of studies that have been done there, and yeah, certainly I want to try and prove that. So the study also highlights Choiseul as being a vibrant hub of pottery production and trade. And this is definitely visible by the time of European contact in the mid-16th century. So in the first European contact, Spanish explorer Mendana reached Santa Isabel. They documented or recorded seeing some clay pots in the southeast end of Santa Isabel. I'd argue it's likely to have it's likely to have been made in Choiseul. And as I touched on a little bit, but some of the findings from the compositional analysis, So pottery that was made on Nutambu is likely to have been reached Lauru Island, Wagina. So there's the links there between Lauru Island and Nutambu is particularly interesting, because it appears that the development intensification of the making of pottery coincided with coincided with the making of kesa. And kesa today is still really revered and held sacred by people from Choiseul. So that's quite sort of interesting finding. And finally, we have greater resolution in our understanding of production centers that operated on Choiseul. So I talked about those 3 major zones of production, but there's likely to be more. And so this occurred in the last 1,000 years, as well as the shared and distinctive stylistic traits of wares dating to this period. And I'll note the close stylistic similarities between Shortland Islands and Nutambu pottery traditions, which definitely needs further exploration. But that was a great outcome of the research. So a lot of people to thank from the course of not just that study, but of course my the PhD, the doctoral research. I'd like to thank particularly my former supervisors, co-authors, Professors Richard Walter and Glenn Summerhays, and our fourth co-author, Associate Professor James Scott. Yeah, thank you. Great thanks to Ben and Matthew and the Center for giving me this opportunity to share my research, and I was very pleased to be the first in the seminar series. And I look forward to the rest of the seminar series and to being able to connect with everyone online, or hopefully, fingers crossed, in person in the future. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Charles. That was a fascinating seminar, and certainly some brilliant research that's really filled in a large gap in what's known about that part of the Solomons. We've got plenty of time, folks. I'll open it up now for some questions. Either you can raise your hand or call out on audio. I've got a quick one. Oh, there we go. Glenn Summerhays. Go ahead.
Dr. Radclyffe, very interesting talk. Congratulations. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You're filling in gaps that needed to be filled in. Where do you see yourself in the next 5 years, or where do you think the priorities are for Solomon Island archaeology?
It's a big question, Glenn, and nice to see you, and thanks for watching the talk. Solomon Islands archaeology, yeah, I think a lot of things come to my mind, but certainly I've always pushed that for me, I have to recognize my privileges. Although, Solomon Island, but my parents have been able to afford to send me overseas to be able to study archaeology. So I think a big goal would be for me and others in some more privileged positions, just trying to increase awareness around archaeology. So that it definitely came into play. And there was a time when we were working in one of the villages I mentioned, Nutambu and Choiseul, out, like me myself being able to speak Solomon Islands Pidgin, and having grown up there, I was very accustomed to sort of some of the traditional practices and expectations communities placed on a newcomer. But I was working with people from the Solomon Islands Museum, and we face a lot of issues with our research. And I think it won't only impact archaeologists and researchers in that field, but others as well, trying to do whatever the research projects that people are interested in carrying out in the Solomons. So increasing public awareness, maintaining and strengthening relationships with overseas unis, such as ANU, Otago, and other institutes. I think those are two big ones. And definitely trying to lobby or put pressure on the government to have better recognition of the cultural heritage. And there's been some progress made. There's currently a new heritage bill being drafted for a national heritage bill for the Solomons. So I'm keep my ears out as that's progressing. And the Ministry of Culture and Tourism there, I've been partly involved in trying to have the Solomon Islands government ratify the UNESCO's Convention on Underwater Cultural Heritage. So they'll have some protection for some of the coastal sites, particularly, and sites that get occasionally inundated. So there's definitely some progress being made. But yeah, for me, it's definitely just, I'd love to just continue my work in the Solomons and working with a lot of others such as yourselves.
Fantastic. Well done. It's good seeing you again too.
You too.
Thanks, Glenn. Any other questions?
Hi. Hello.
Yep. Hi, Matthew.
Hey.
Hi.
Go for it.
Hi, Charles. Great talk.
Thanks, Matthew.
I sympathise on the land disputes leading to the archaeology stopping, as that's a pretty common experience we get here all the time in Vanuatu as well. So it's very annoying at the time, but I'm sure after a few years you'll be able to go back and get some more work done. My question was that I noticed in some of your slides you had dots representing pottery in sort of Booker, North Solomons, but of course pottery making is quite widespread in various parts, including Buin and Siwai in the south, certainly up to the ethnographic period. So I wondered if in your wider thesis you'd looked at some of these other mainland Bougainville sequences, such as John Terrell had done some work in the south there, and work which I'd done in Central East, Pidia and Asio styles that I defined there some years ago. So I wondered if you'd actually included them in your thesis, or if not, why you hadn't referred to any of the, as you move further north, it seems that pottery making becomes quite widespread in the northern Solomons.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Matthew, and highlighting that. In my thesis, definitely I give a background to some of the pottery traditions documented in those parts of the Solomons, and like you're saying, there's certainly interlinks or links historical, cultural between at least certainly northwest Choiseul and nearby Shortland Islands, southeast Bougainville, and further. In the paper, from memory, I think we do touch on it a bit. I just didn't have time in this talk to be able to talk about some of the sort of interregional comparisons. And I think it's certainly something I'd like to explore further. I'm definitely interested in pottery traditions from Bougainville and your work like Nissan. And for me, I think it's a matter of once I get a even better hold and understanding of the ceramic record in Choiseul, then being able to continue to build on further and think about what are some of the links. And I would definitely be interested possibly for looking at some of the geochemistry and mineralogy of some of the pottery from Bougainville and parts, because for my study it was mainly focused on from Choiseul, but I'd definitely be interested in trying to investigate that further.
Certainly those collections are available at the ANU. Whether you'll ever, when you'll be able to get there to have a look at them, I don't know. When I'll be able to get there to have a look at them too. But certainly I'd be happy to share the material which we still have there.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Matthew. Jim, you got a question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Hi. Excuse me. My apologies. I've just got back from shopping. I was working on West Coast time instead of East Coast. So my apologies. I have to admit I've missed virtually all your talk. One of the things that has puzzled me for many years is that the Booker sequence shows massive changes in the pottery styles over the last 3,000 years. But there seems to be less dramatic change, fewer dramatic changes further south you go, whether it be Bougainville or Solomon Islands. I'd just like to ask you, do you have any thoughts about why this might be so?
Thanks very much, Jim, and no worries for missing my talk. Yeah, so it was mainly based on a paper, and I'm happy to share it with you and to be able to catch up further on it. With my thoughts on less drastic changes. I think looking at the ceramic sequence on the whole for Choiseul, you know, trying to think from around 2,700 years ago or so to basically a present day, or at least the last few hundred years. Yeah, it's a bit frustrating because there's quite a large gap in the archaeological record, at least for dated stratified ceramic deposits. But there's few that date to between 2,000 to 1,000 years ago. And that's a real crucial time, I think, because from around 1,000 years ago, there's, or at least within the last 800 years, you have the development pretty much all at one time with shrine construction, head hunting, and there's intensification and exchange of shell valuables. So yeah, I would be really interested to see, you know, have a better understanding as what's going on between 2000 to the last 1,000 years ago. But with the last 1,000 years, I'm grateful at least from this work, we now have a better understanding as to where pottery was being made in Choiseul, you know, what was the nature of pottery production there. And I argue in the paper, you know, it wasn't the same scale as Booker. It appears, you know, in Choiseul, but it was definitely a large part of, it was definitely influential in people's mobility, and it appears pottery was reaching a lot of different parts of the Western Solomon. So it was quite a vibrant hub. But yeah, so I think basically I would need to do more research is my answer, Jim, I think.
No, thanks. And you're touching there on a point which is very pertinent to the entire Western Pacific. And that is there are massive gaps in knowledge, both in terms of coverage as well as the sequences. So I wish you well in your future work.
Thanks very much, Jim.
Thanks, Jim. Any further questions? Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And once again, Charles, congratulations on your study and a fantastic seminar today. And thank you for joining us. I greatly appreciate it. And
Thanks
thank you
very
everyone
much,
for coming along.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Charles.
Cheers, Charles.